The banquet hall was exquisite. Crystal chandeliers spilling golden light across polished marble floors, servers gliding between tables with bottles of expensive wine, and the low hum of wealthy laughter filling the air. I had been invited to this dinner alongside my wife, only to be treated like I didn't belong there. If you're not yet subscribed, take a second to subscribe right now and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new story drops. These stories only get crazier from here, and you'll want to be part of it early. All right, back to the story. I didn't always look like this. Not in the way people assumed. The simple blazer, the old watch, the habit of checking prices before buying anything. It wasn't because I couldn't afford more. It was because I had trained myself not to. Years of discipline had built that habit into me. I learned early that money isn't something you show off. It's something you protect, grow, multiply quietly. Emily tightened her grip on my arm as we stepped deeper into the hall. "Just ignore them if they start," she whispered, her voice low, almost apologetic. I nodded slightly. I always do. And that was the truth. Her family had never liked me. From the moment we got married, they had already decided who I was. A man with no real ambition, no visible success, no place among them. In their eyes, I was the mistake she made. What they didn't know was that I had stopped trying to prove anything a long time ago. Tonight wasn't about changing their minds. It was about letting them believe everything they already thought. "Emily!" Her mother's voice cut through the room with practiced elegance. She approached in a gown that probably cost more than most people's monthly income, her smile perfectly placed, until her eyes landed on me. "Oh," she said lightly. "Daniel, you made it." "I was invited," I replied calmly. A brief pause followed. "Well," she continued, already half turning away, "we weren't sure you'd feel comfortable in a place like this." Emily shifted beside me. "Mom." "It's fine," I said quietly. Because it was. This was expected. Her father joined us moments later, finishing a conversation with a group of sharply dressed men. He gave me a short nod, the kind you give out of obligation, not respect. "Daniel," he said, "I hope you understand the level of company we have tonight." "I'll manage," I answered. That earned me a look, brief, dismissive. Then came Mark, already holding a glass of wine, confidence written all over his face. "Honestly, I'm surprised you showed up," he said with a smirk. "This doesn't really look like your kind of place." "It doesn't have to," I replied. He chuckled. "Yeah, sure." We were led to the table, long, elegant, filled with people who barely paused their conversations as we approached, but their eyes did. Quick glances, silent judgments, measuring, dismissing. I pulled out Emily's chair before taking mine. A small gesture. No one acknowledged it. A server came around with wine. When he reached me, there was a slight hesitation. "Water is fine," I said. Mark leaned back, grinning wider. "Smart choice," he said loudly. "Wouldn't want you ordering something you can't afford." A few laughs spread across the table. Emily went still beside me. I didn't react. But this time, it wasn't just patience. It was intention. Because every word they said, every look they gave, I was letting it happen, letting it build. Because when the truth finally came out, it wouldn't need an explanation. Dinner began with the kind of elegance that made everything feel staged. Perfectly timed service, polished smiles, and conversations that revolved around money without ever mentioning it directly. Deals, investments, properties, connections. It was all woven into casual dialogue like a language everyone at the table understood. Except me. Or at least, that's what they thought. "I just closed on another property downtown," one of the guests said, swirling his wine. "The return on that area is going to double within 2 years." Emily's father nodded approvingly.
Smart move. Timing is everything in this market. Then, as if on cue, his eyes shifted towards me. So, Daniel, he leaned back slightly, what is it exactly that you do these days? There it was. Not curiosity. A test. The table grew just a little quieter. Not enough to be obvious, but enough for me to notice. I kept my expression neutral. I work. A small pause. Mark let out a short laugh. Yeah, we figured that part out, but what kind of work? I picked up my glass of water, taking a slow sip before answering. Something simple. That did it. A few smirks, a few exchanged looks. Oh, come on, Mark pressed, leaning forward. You can't be that mysterious about it. What, you don't want to say because it sounds small? A couple of guests chuckled softly. Emily shifted beside me again. Mark, that's enough. But he wasn't done. No, I'm just curious, he continued, raising his hands in mock innocence. I mean, we're all sharing here, right? Daniel set his glass down carefully. I prefer to keep things private. That answer didn't help. If anything, it made it worse. Private, he repeated, grinning, usually means unemployed or underpaid. This time, the laughter was louder. Even some of the guests who hadn't spoken yet were smiling now. I could feel Emily's discomfort growing beside me, but I didn't look at her. Instead, I looked around the table, at the confidence, the assumptions, the certainty in their eyes. They had already decided who I was, and nothing I said right now would change that. So why bother? Well, Emily's father said with a thin smile, as long as you're taking care of your responsibilities. There was a weight behind that sentence, an implication that maybe I wasn't. I am, I replied simply. Mark leaned back again, clearly entertained. Hey, as long as my sister's not the one paying for everything, I guess we're good. That one landed harder. The table reacted instantly. Some people laughed, others tried to hide it, but the damage was done. Emily turned to him sharply. That's not true. Relax, Mark said, waving him off. I'm joking. But he wasn't, and everyone knew it. A server approached again, placing the first course in front of us, something delicate, carefully arranged, and probably overpriced. Mark glanced at my plate, then back at me. Careful, he said under his breath, but just loud enough. That alone probably costs more than what you spend in a day. Another round of quiet laughter. I picked up my fork calmly. No reaction. No defense. Nothing. And that confused them more than anything else, because they were expecting something. Embarrassment. Anger. A reaction. But I gave them none. Not because I couldn't, but because I was waiting. Waiting for them to go further. To cross the line completely. Because once they did, there would be no coming back from it.
The conversation didn't recover after that. If anything, it shifted into something sharper, more deliberate, like everyone at the table had silently agreed to lean into the same narrative, the successful ones on one side and me on the other. Invisible but not entirely ignorable, just present enough to be reminded of my place. Emily tried to steer things back into safer territory, asking one of the guests about a recent trip to Monaco, but even that didn't last long. The topic circled back, as it always did, to money, status, and success. It was their comfort zone, their identity, and tonight it was also their weapon. So, Daniel, one of the men across the table said, adjusting his cufflinks, you must have some plans for the future, right? Career growth, investments, something along those lines? The tone sounded polite, but the intention wasn't. It was the kind of question designed to expose, not understand. Daniel placed his fork down neatly before answering. I have plans. Mark let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head as he leaned back. That's the most vague answer I've heard all night. You're sure those plans actually exist?
A few smiles appeared again, quieter this time, but just as sharp. "I'm working on them," Daniel replied calmly. "Working on them," Mark repeated, almost amused. "You see, that's the difference. Everyone here isn't working on plans. They've already made it happen." He gestured around the table as if presenting evidence. "That's what success looks like." Daniel followed his gesture briefly, his eyes moving across the polished surfaces, the expensive watches, the confident postures. Then he looked back at his plate. "I see," he said simply. Emily's father leaned forward slightly, his expression tightening just enough to show he was no longer pretending. "You have to understand something, Daniel," he said, his voice measured but firm. "Being with my daughter comes with a certain expectation, stability, growth, a standard." Emily's hand tensed beside him. "Dad, please." "I'm just being honest," he continued, cutting her off. "We've been patient, but at some point effort has to translate into visible results." There it was again. Not concern, not advice, judgment. Daniel nodded slowly, as if considering the words. "I understand." Daniel leaned forward this time, resting his elbows on the table, clearly enjoying the moment. "Do you, though?" he said. "Because from where we're sitting, it just looks like Emily settled, and I'm trying to figure out why." The table went quiet. Not the casual kind of quiet. This one was heavy, intentional, waiting. Emily turned sharply toward him. "That's enough, Mark." But he didn't stop. "No, seriously," he went on, his voice louder now, pulling everyone into it. "Look around, Emily. Look at the kind of men here. Then look at him. You really think this makes sense?" A few people shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. No one defended him. Daniel remained still, his expression unchanged, but something behind his eyes had hardened. Not anger, not yet. Something colder, more controlled. He reached for his glass of water again, taking a slow sip before setting it down with precision. "I think it makes perfect sense," he said quietly. Mark smirked. "Of course you do." But Daniel didn't elaborate. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. And that, more than anything else, unsettled the room. Because they were pushing him, expecting him to break, to react, to justify his existence at that table. But he didn't. He let the silence stretch just long enough to become uncomfortable. Because now they weren't just teasing anymore. They had crossed the line. And Daniel knew something they didn't. The moment you let people fully reveal how they see you is the moment you take away their power to define you. And tonight, they were revealing everything. Dinner moved on, but whatever illusion of politeness had been holding the evening together was gone now. The conversations resumed, yet there was an undercurrent to them, something sharper, like every word spoken carried a second meaning. Daniel could feel it in the way people occasionally glanced in his direction, in the way Mark smirked to himself, in the way Emily sat just a little tighter beside him. The next course was served, something elaborate and delicately arranged, but Daniel barely looked at it. He had already understood what this night was about. It wasn't dinner, it was demonstration, and he was the example. One of the guests, a woman seated near Emily's mother, leaned forward slightly and smiled in that polite, calculated way people used when they were about to ask something inappropriate. "So, Daniel," she said, her tone light but curious, "how did you and Emily meet?" It sounded harmless, but it wasn't. It was another setup, another opportunity to measure him against the version of Emily they believed she deserved. Daniel glanced briefly at Emily before answering. "We met a few years ago. It was simple." "Simple," Mark cut in quickly, clearly not satisfied with that answer. "Yeah, that sounds about right." A few smiles appeared again, this time quieter, but just as sharp. "I'm working on them," Daniel replied calmly. "Working on them," Mark repeated, almost amused. "You see, that's the difference. Everyone here isn't working on plans. They've already made it happen." He gestured around the table as if presenting evidence. "That's what success looks like." Daniel followed his gesture briefly, his eyes moving across the polished surfaces, the expensive watches, the confident postures. Then he looked back at his plate. "I see," he said simply. Emily's father leaned forward slightly, his expression tightening just enough to show he was no longer pretending. "You have to understand something, Daniel," he said, his voice measured but firm. "Being with my daughter comes with a certain expectation, stability, growth, a standard." Emily's hand tensed beside him. "Dad, please." "I'm just being honest," he continued, cutting her off. "We've been patient, but at some point, effort has to translate into visible results." There it was again. Not concern, not advice. Judgment. Daniel nodded slowly as if considering the words. "I understand." Mark leaned forward this time, resting his elbows on the table, clearly enjoying the moment. "Do you, though?" he said. "Because from where we're sitting, it just looks like Emily's settled, and I'm trying to figure out why." The table went quiet. Not the casual kind of quiet. This one was heavy, intentional, waiting. Emily turned sharply toward him. "That's enough, Mark." But he didn't stop. "No, seriously," he went on, his voice louder now, pulling everyone into it. "Look around, Emily. Look at the kind of men here. Then look at him. You really think this makes sense?" A few people shifted uncomfortably, but no one spoke. No one defended him. Daniel remained still, his expression unchanged, but something behind his eyes had hardened. Not anger, not yet. Something colder, more controlled. He reached for his glass of water again, taking a slow sip before setting it down with precision. "I think it makes perfect sense," he said quietly. Mark smirked. "Of course you do." But Daniel didn't elaborate. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. And that, more than anything else, unsettled the room. Because they were pushing him, expecting him to break, to react, to justify his existence at that table. But he didn't. He let the silence stretch just long enough to become uncomfortable. Because now they weren't just teasing anymore. They had crossed the line. And Daniel knew something they didn't. The moment you let people fully reveal how they see you is the moment you take away their power to define you. And tonight, they were revealing everything. Dinner moved on, but whatever illusion of politeness had been holding the evening together was gone now. The conversations resumed, yet there was an undercurrent to them, something sharper, like every word spoken carried a second meaning. Daniel could feel it in the way people occasionally glanced in his direction, in the way Mark smirked to himself, in the way Emily sat just a little tighter beside him. The next course was served, something elaborate and delicately arranged, but Daniel barely looked at it. He had already understood what this night was about. It wasn't dinner, it was demonstration, and he was the example. One of the guests, a woman seated near Emily's mother, leaned forward slightly and smiled in that polite, calculated way people used when they were about to ask something inappropriate. "So, Daniel," her tone sounded light but curious, "how did you and Emily meet?" It sounded harmless, but it wasn't. It was another setup, another opportunity to measure him against the version of Emily they believed she deserved. Daniel glanced briefly at Emily before answering. "We met a few years ago. It was simple." "Simple," Mark cut in quickly, clearly not satisfied with that answer. "Yeah, that sounds about right." A few smiles appeared again, this time quieter, but just as sharp. "Why does everything have to be a joke to you?" she snapped. Mark raised his hand, slightly feigning innocence. "I'm just saying there's nothing wrong with simple. It fits." Her mother sighed softly as if Emily was the one making things uncomfortable. "Let's not turn this into an argument," she said, before turning back to Daniel with a thin smile. "We're just trying to understand you better." Daniel met her gaze calmly. "There's not much to understand." "That's exactly the problem," Mark muttered under his breath, though loud enough for everyone to hear. This time, even Emily's father didn't intervene. Instead, he took a slow sip of his wine, watching quietly as if observing how far things would go. And they went further. The conversation shifted again, this time towards finances, investments, and assets.
It wasn't subtle anymore. One of the men at the table began talking about portfolios, casually mentioning numbers that would make most people pause. Another followed, speaking about expanding his business overseas. Then, almost inevitably, the attention circled back. "What about you, Daniel?" the same man asked, looking directly at him now. Do you invest? The question landed differently this time. It wasn't just curiosity. It was exposure. Mark leaned forward slightly, already smiling in anticipation. Emily looked at Daniel, a quiet warning in her eyes, but also something else. Hope, maybe, that he would say something, anything to stop this. Daniel rested his hands calmly on the table. Yes, he said. The answer was simple, too simple. Mark blinked, then let out a short laugh. You invest? He repeated. In what? Saving coins? That earned a louder reaction from the table. Even some of the guests who had remained neutral until now couldn't hold back their amusement. Daniel didn't react. In different things, he added calmly. Like what? Mark pressed immediately. Come on, don't go vague again. Give us something real. There was a pause, not because Daniel didn't have an answer, but because he was choosing whether to give one. Then he shook his head slightly. It wouldn't mean much here. That was the moment everything shifted. Mark leaned back, laughing openly now. You hear that? He said, looking around the table. It wouldn't mean much here. That's code for there's nothing to talk about. The laughter followed quickly, louder, more confident. Emily looked down at her plate, her expression tightening, and for the first time that night, Daniel noticed something he hadn't wanted to see. Not just discomfort, embarrassment. Not toward him, but because of the situation, because of what her family was doing. Daniel's gaze softened for just a second before returning to the table. He let the laughter settle, let the moment stretch, let them believe they had won this round completely, because now they weren't holding back anymore. Now they were comfortable, and when people get comfortable, that's when they make their biggest mistakes. The laughter didn't fade immediately. It lingered softly around the table like a signal that the tone of the evening had been permanently set. Daniel sat through it without reacting, his posture unchanged, his expression calm, almost detached, as if he were observing the scene rather than participating in it. Across from him, Mark wiped the corner of his eye, still amused, while Emily's mother exchanged a knowing glance with one of the guests. Whatever restraint they might have had earlier was gone now. This had become entertainment. The next few minutes passed with conversations overlapping again, but Daniel could feel it. He had become the quiet center of the room, the unspoken reference point in every subtle joke and side comment. Someone mentioned starting from nothing, and another added, well, some people stay there, followed by a few restrained chuckles. No names were used, but none were needed. Emily finally leaned closer to him, her voice barely audible. I'm so sorry, she whispered. Daniel turned slightly toward her, his tone steady. You don't have to be. She searched his face, as if trying to understand how he could remain so composed. But before she could say anything else, her father's voice cut in again, drawing attention back to the head of the table. You know, he began, setting his glass down with deliberate care, I've always believed that a man's value is reflected in what he can provide, not just financially, but in presence, in growth, in ambition. He paused, letting the words settle before continuing. And when I look around this table, I see men who have built something, who have proven themselves. His gaze shifted, slowly, until it landed directly on Daniel. And then there are those who are still figuring things out. The implication was clear, and this time it wasn't dressed as humor. It was direct, intentional, final. A few guests shifted slightly in their seats, sensing the weight of the moment, but no one interrupted. Mark leaned back again, arms crossed, clearly satisfied with how things were unfolding. Emily straightened beside Daniel, her patience finally breaking. This isn't fair, she said, her voice firm but controlled. You don't even know what you're talking about. Her father raised an eyebrow. Then enlighten us, he replied. What exactly is it that he does that we're all missing? The question hung in the air, heavier than anything that had been said before. For the first time that night, all eyes turned fully toward Daniel, not with casual curiosity, but with expectation. This was it, the moment they had been pushing toward, the moment they wanted him to fail, to hesitate, to prove them right. Emily looked at him again, this time not with worry, but with quiet belief. She didn't know everything, but she knew enough to trust him. Daniel exhaled slowly, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table. He could feel the shift in the room, the anticipation building, the certainty in their minds that whatever he said next would only confirm their assumptions. And for a brief second, he considered it, ending it right there, saying something simple, something vague, letting the night continue exactly as they expected. But then he looked at Emily, at the way she had defended him, at the way she had endured all of this because of him, and something changed. Not in his expression, not in his posture, but in his decision. He wasn't going to expose everything, not yet, but he also wasn't going to let this moment pass unanswered. Daniel lifted his gaze, meeting her father's eyes directly for the first time that night without any softness behind it. "You're right," he said calmly. The response caught them slightly off guard. Mark frowned faintly, as if he hadn't expected agreement. "I am," her father replied. Daniel nodded once. "A man's value is reflected in what he builds," he continued, "but not everything worth building needs to be visible." A small pause followed. Confusion flickered across a few faces. Mark scoffed lightly. "That sounds like something people say when they don't have anything to show." A few quiet laughs followed again, but this time they didn't carry the same confidence, because Daniel hadn't reacted the way they expected. He hadn't folded. He hadn't defended himself either. He had simply stood there, steady, unmoved, and that unsettled them more than any argument could have. Daniel reached for his glass again, taking a slow sip before setting it back down. Then, without raising his voice, without forcing attention, he added, "But you'll see." The words were simple, quiet, almost effortless, but they landed differently, not as a defense, not as a claim, but as a certainty. And for the first time that night, the table didn't immediately laugh, because something in his tone made it clear. He wasn't guessing. He knew, and that made all the difference. The room went quiet for a moment after Daniel's words, not because anyone was impressed, they weren't, but because they didn't know how to respond. The table had grown comfortable in mocking him, in pointing out his supposed shortcomings, and suddenly that rhythm had been interrupted. Mark leaned forward, narrowing his eyes, clearly trying to read him. "You'll see, huh? That sounds ambitious," he said with that teasing edge that suggested he was certain he would fail. Daniel smiled faintly, but not in humor, the kind of smile that made people uncomfortable because it didn't belong to the narrative they had crafted. Emily exhaled quietly beside him, tension in her shoulders easing just a little. She had expected this response from him, and she trusted it. Her mother, still sitting upright with that same polite mask, tilted her head slightly, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "Do you mean we'll see tonight?" she asked carefully. Daniel shook his head almost imperceptibly. "Not tonight," he said quietly. "Someday soon." Mark's smirk faltered slightly. He glanced at his father, seeking reassurance, but found none. Emily's father continued sipping his wine, a neutral expression masking whatever thoughts were crossing his mind, but the shift in energy at the table was palpable. Conversations resumed, but this time there was hesitation in the tone, a slight caution in the laughter. Daniel continued eating, slowly, deliberately, savoring each bite without rush, without reaction to the barbs thrown his direction. He had learned long ago how to cultivate patience, how to let others speak, let them reveal themselves, let them believe they are in control. And now they were, but that control was illusory. One of the guests attempted another jab, lightly asking about his background, about what real work he did. But Daniel answered with the same calm brevity he had used all night. "I'm focused on what matters most." It wasn't a revelation, but the tone carried weight. Mark frowned again, leaning back and laughing nervously this time. Sounds like something a motivational poster would say. Daniel didn't respond. He didn't need to. The silence that followed was more powerful than any argument. Emily's mother tried to fill it with polite chatter about the table setting, the choice of wine, the city skyline outside,
But even her words couldn't shake the subtle tension Daniel had introduced. He was like a quiet storm. They hadn't noticed it coming, and now it was impossible to ignore. Emily watched him closely, admiration mixed with relief in her gaze. She had endured her family's judgment countless times, but she had never seen him like this before. Steady, unshakable, and fully aware of every glance, every subtle dig, every expectation that had been imposed on him. He was letting them believe they were winning, and yet they were already losing. Daniel took a final sip of water before putting it down. He looked around the table once, slowly, making sure every eye met his for just a fraction longer than expected, and then he smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly. It was enough to unsettle them again. Because in that smile, in that calm certainty, there was a promise that all the judgments, all the ridicule, all the assumptions about his worth were irrelevant. Daniel had waited, he had observed, and soon, very soon, they would see the truth. The main course arrived, an elaborate arrangement of meats, sauces, and garnishes that looked more like art than food. Daniel barely glanced at it, his focus still on the table, on the subtle power plays unfolding around him. Emily tried to keep the conversation moving, asking Mark about his latest business venture, but he was distracted, his attention snapping back to Daniel every few seconds. "So, Daniel," said Mark finally, with that same sharp grin that had haunted the evening, "you must have some big projects yourself. Surely you do more than just work." Daniel placed his fork down carefully and looked at him directly. "I do," he said calmly. Mark laughed lightly, tilting his head. "Of course you do. We're all waiting to hear what it is." Daniel smiled faintly, a slow, deliberate expression that held nothing but quiet confidence. "You'll see," he replied.
Emily's mother interjected politely, her voice gentle but carrying the weight of scrutiny. "Daniel, perhaps you could give us a little insight. We'd love to know more about your ambitions." Daniel nodded slightly, acknowledging her, but he didn't elaborate. Instead, he lifted his wine glass, not to drink, just a small gesture, and said softly, "I'm focused on long-term growth. Some things take time. Some things aren't visible immediately." A subtle silence fell over the table. Guests exchanged glances, unsure how to respond. Emily's father leaned back, setting down his glass slowly, the faintest crease of concern appearing on his forehead. Mark scoffed lightly. "That's convenient. Always taking time, always invisible. Sounds like a story someone tells to feel important when they're not." Daniel's expression didn't change. He reached for his water glass, paused, and looked around the table with a calm precision that made several guests shift in their seats. "If you think invisibility equals weakness, that's your perception," he said evenly. "It doesn't define reality." The words landed heavier than any argument. Emily's mother glanced at her husband, silently asking whether to intervene, but he remained still, clearly uncertain. Mark leaned forward, frustration creeping into his tone. "Are you saying we've underestimated you? That you're more than we think?" Daniel's eyes held his for a moment, a quiet weight in the gaze. "Yes," he said simply, "more than appearances suggest, more than assumptions allow, and that's all I need you to know for now." A few quiet murmurs spread across the table. Emily's hand brushed against his, a small gesture of reassurance and connection. She had seen his discipline, his patience, his deliberate silence all night. Now the first hint of a different energy began to settle over the room, an unspoken tension that suggested Daniel was not only aware of the humiliation, but was in control of it. Mark's grin faltered slightly, a rare crack in his confidence. He had expected resistance, excuses, maybe even embarrassment. Instead, Daniel had taken the silence, the scrutiny, the ridicule, and turned it into a quiet demonstration of command. Emily's father finally spoke, his voice neutral but cautious. "I see. You've thought about this carefully." Daniel nodded once. "Always." The rest of the table fell into a quiet, awkward pause. No one wanted to push too far. The jabs had lost their edge. The laughter had faded. Daniel had let them think they were in control all night, and now, without raising his voice or boasting, he had shifted the balance subtly, almost imperceptibly.
Emily exhaled softly beside him, her relief and admiration mixing in her expression. She had known there was more to him, but seeing it unfold like this, quietly, deliberately, it was something else entirely. Daniel returned his focus to his plate briefly. The calm, measured way he ate contrasted sharply with the tense energy around him. The dinner continued, but the tone had changed. What had started as humiliation and mockery was now tempered by uncertainty. And Daniel knew that once dessert arrived, the real story, the one that would finally make them see everything they had assumed, was about to begin. Dessert arrived. Small, intricate creations on delicate plates, each piece more decorative than the last. Daniel didn't rush. He watched instead. The room had changed. The energy was no longer of mockery, but of curiosity, of subtle tension. Guests who had laughed earlier now leaned slightly forward, observing him, waiting for the next move, trying to read him. Emily exhaled softly beside him. Her hand brushed his under the table for reassurance. He gave a faint nod, almost imperceptible, but enough to let her know he had control. Mark, still trying to reclaim dominance, leaned back in his chair and smirked. "So, Daniel, tell us something. What makes you so sure of yourself? What do you actually do that we can't see?" Daniel's eyes met his, calm and unshakable. "I invest my time and resources carefully," he said quietly, but deliberately. "I don't need to advertise it." Mark laughed, though less confidently than before. "Sounds like a nice way to say you're doing nothing." A few quiet chuckles followed, but the edge was gone. Daniel's expression didn't change. He said evenly, "Not nothing. Everything you see here," he gestured subtly toward the room, "is built from what I've chosen not to reveal." That statement landed, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, subtle and precise. The table shifted just slightly. Her father's brow furrowed, curiosity now laced with something like unease. Emily's mother studied him closely, realizing that the man they had assumed powerless had been measuring them all along. Mark frowned, clearly uncomfortable, but not ready to back down. "So, are you saying all this time you've been hiding what?" Daniel smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly, his eyes holding a calm certainty that unsettled the entire table. "Not hiding, choosing discretion." He reached for his wallet, but he didn't pull it out fully. He simply rested it on the table, letting the corner peek out. A subtle flash of a designer emblem caught a few peripheral glances. A guest nudged Mark slightly, and he noticed the detail too late. The smirk had faded from his face. Emily's father's hand twitched over his glass, curiosity turning into recognition, though he didn't speak yet. Emily leaned closer to Daniel under the table, whispering, "Do it." He didn't respond verbally. He simply slid the wallet slightly, letting more of it show without making a scene. The effect was instantaneous. Whispers rippled across the table. People's expressions changed from judgment to disbelief. Mark's face lost his confident grin, replaced by a flash of panic. "Wait, that can't be yours," he muttered under his breath. Daniel didn't answer. He let them process it, let the silence stretch, making the revelation land fully. Emily's mother's polite mask cracked ever so slightly, confusion flickering in her eyes. Emily's father finally set down his wineglass, leaning forward, voice steady but cautious. "Daniel, these investments, your projects, you speak of them in such measured terms. Surely there must be evidence somewhere." Daniel placed his glass down carefully and let his hand draft toward his phone, which he had kept face down all evening. He unlocked it smoothly, revealing a neatly organized dashboard of multiple accounts, holdings, and ventures spanning real estate, tech startups, and international investments. Without raising his voice, he swiped through carefully curated screenshots, letting just enough show on the screen to catch their attention. The room went quiet. Mark leaned in, trying to read over his shoulder, but Daniel shifted slightly, keeping the display just tantalizing enough to provoke curiosity without giving full access. "These are a few of the projects I'm managing personally," he said evenly. "I prefer to stay involved directly rather than advertise publicly. A few quiet whispers spread across the table. Emily's mother's eyes widened slightly, her composed mask cracking ever so slightly. Emily's father leaned back, a hand running over his face, processing the information slowly, incredulity mixing with a begrudging respect. Mark's confident facade finally cracked completely. "All this? All of this? You own?" he stammered, glancing at the numbers and graphs in disbelief. Daniel nodded once, calmly, deliberately. "I've cultivated what matters quietly. There was no reason to flaunt it until it became relevant." Emily's hand touched his under the table, a small reassurance, her pride visible despite the tension. Daniel returned the gaze of her family, eyes steady and unyielding. "Tonight," he continued, "you treated me as though I had nothing, as though I were beneath you. That assumption was entirely your own. Now, perhaps, you'll see that value isn't always visible. It's measured in patience, discretion, and discipline." The table fell silent. Guests no longer whispered, they stared, trying to reconcile the man they had judged for hours with the reality now undeniable before them. Emily's father set down his wineglass slowly, leaning forward, a mix of admiration and chagrin in his tone. "I didn't expect this," he said quietly. Emily's mother reached for her napkin, briefly hiding a reaction she couldn't suppress. Mark leaned back, pale, the smirk gone, replaced by tension and incredulity. "So, all this? Everything you said? It wasn't just talk?" he asked shakily. Daniel smiled faintly. "It was never talk, it was preparation, and tonight you witnessed only a fraction." He returned to his wine calmly, taking another sip, as if he had just completed a casual evening ritual, not revealed a fortune. Emily exhaled softly beside him, relief and admiration mixing in her expression. She had known he was disciplined, resourceful, and clever, but the scale of it, the quiet mastery, it was something else entirely. The evening had changed entirely. The humiliation intended for him had transformed into a lesson for them, a subtle, undeniable demonstration of control and accomplishment. Daniel's calm, measured presence had rewritten the narrative at the table. For the first time that night, no one laughed, no one made assumptions, only recognition remained, the kind that left people uncomfortable, humbled, and silently calculating how they had misjudged a man who had done everything quietly, intentionally, and perfectly.
The final piece of the evening had arrived, not with fanfare, but with subtle inevitability. Daniel placed his wineglass down and let his gaze sweep the table slowly, deliberately, catching every expression, every flicker of doubt, disbelief, and finally, awe. Emily's family sat frozen, no longer trying to dominate, no longer trying to belittle. The man they had mocked, the man they had assumed powerless, now quietly held all the attention. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone again, this time opening a secure app that displayed live holdings, multiple properties across the city, investments in high-profile startups, offshore accounts, and liquid assets moving silently in the background. Each number, each graph was a quiet declaration of power. The room was silent. Even Mark, whose bravado had dominated the night, leaned back in his chair, pale, unable to process what he was seeing. Emily's father finally spoke, voice low but deliberate. "Daniel, all of this, it's yours?" Daniel nodded, his calm unbroken. "It's what I've built quietly over the years, without need for approval, without need for recognition. Everything I do has purpose, and everything I build is measured carefully." A flicker of disbelief passed across Emily's mother's face, quickly replaced with respect. I didn't realize," she murmured, trailing off as if the words had lost meaning. Daniel didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The silence itself was testimony. The quiet power, the restraint, the patience he had shown all evening, those had already rewritten every assumption they had about him. Mark finally cleared his throat, trying to recover. You really didn't say anything all night because—" He trailed off, unable to finish. Daniel met his gaze steadily. "Because appearances are deceiving and assumptions are dangerous. You assumed I lacked status, wealth, or ambition. You assumed I could be humiliated. And now you see how wrong those assumptions were." Emily's hand found his under the table, squeezing it softly. She had known he was exceptional, but the full magnitude of his success and the calm way he had unveiled it was something else entirely. Her father leaned back slowly, exhaling. We misjudged you," he admitted, his voice quiet, almost reluctant. "It seems we underestimated your discipline and foresight." Daniel allowed a faint smile. "Underestimation can be powerful. It teaches patience, it measures character, and tonight it has taught all of us something important." The tension that had dominated the room all evening had shifted completely. No laughter, no mockery, only recognition, tempered by disbelief that the man they had ridiculed was not only their equal, but far beyond what they had assumed. Daniel returned his gaze to the table, calmly setting down his phone. Every subtle movement carried authority, quiet control, and unshakable confidence. He hadn't raised his voice, he hadn't shouted, he hadn't argued, and yet the effect was absolute. Emily exhaled softly beside him, pride clear in her expression. Mark slumped slightly, defeated without words, the realization of being outmatched evident in his posture. The rest of the guests whispered quietly among themselves, trying to reconcile their assumptions with the undeniable evidence before them. Emily's father, the man who had spent the night judging him and testing him, now simply nodded slowly. "It seems the lesson tonight is ours to learn," he said quietly. Daniel inclined his head slightly. "Exactly," he replied evenly. "Appearances can mislead. Assumptions can fail. Patience, discretion, and discipline, those define real success." The night had changed completely. The man who had arrived quietly, seemingly unremarkable, now commanded the room not with noise, but with undeniable presence and the subtle revelation of wealth and power. By the time the last course had been cleared, the atmosphere at the table had shifted completely. The laughter, the teasing, the judgments, they were gone, replaced by a quiet, almost reverent recognition of who Daniel truly was. Mark sat frozen, shoulders tense, clearly calculating how he had misjudged the man he had tried to humiliate. Emily's father leaned back slowly, a mixture of surprise and reluctant admiration on his face. Emily's mother, usually composed and critical, now looked at him with a subtle acknowledgment of respect. Daniel sat calmly, sipping his wine, every gesture deliberate, every expression controlled. "Tonight has been revealing," he said softly, allowing the words to fill the room. "Not just for me, but for everyone here. Assumptions are easy. Observations can mislead. But patience, strategy, and discretion, those are the tools of true success." Emily's hand brushed against his under the table, pride and quiet relief mixing in her gaze. "You've shown them everything without ever raising your voice," she whispered. Daniel only nodded slightly. The effect was greater than any argument, any outburst, any defense could have been. Mark finally leaned forward, voice shaking slightly. "So all the properties, all the investments, you've been managing this quietly the entire time?" Daniel set his glass down carefully. "Exactly. Quietly, deliberately.
Success doesn't need constant validation, and assumptions often blind people to what's right in front of them. The room stayed silent. The guests, once mocking, now whispered in disbelief. Emily's father finally spoke, voice soft, thoughtful. We misjudged you, completely. Daniel allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile, and that misjudgment was entirely avoidable, but lessons are always better learned the hard way. Mark didn't respond. His arrogance had been dismantled without confrontation, without drama, without spectacle. Emily exhaled softly, leaning closer. "Thank you," she murmured. Daniel's attention returned to her briefly, his calm unbroken. "Patience, Emily, always patience. That's how I've built everything." And with that, the room settled into a new quiet, one of awe and recognition. No one dared challenge him further. The subtle but absolute power he held was undeniable. The night had begun with humiliation aimed at him, with judgments that assumed weakness, but it ended with him quietly demonstrating mastery, control, and wealth beyond their expectations. As the guests gradually rose to leave, the lesson had been delivered. Daniel remained composed, guiding Emily out of the hall with a calm confidence that left lingering disbelief in the minds of everyone present. Outside, the city lights glimmered subtly, reflecting subtly on his polished watch and sleek coat, a quiet signal of the life he had built, hidden in plain sight. Emily smiled up at him. "You were incredible tonight," she said. He only smiled faintly, sliding his hand into hers. Sometimes the best victories are quiet. The night ended, but the story of what had occurred, the quiet dismantling of assumptions, the revelation of hidden wealth, the subtle mastery of power, was unforgettable. And for those watching this story now, remember, appearances can mislead, assumptions can mislead, and patience combined with quiet control can turn any humiliation into triumph. If you're not yet subscribed, resubscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay updated with new story releases like this one. Back to the story now. What would you have done if you were in Daniel's shoes? Would you have revealed your success immediately or let them underestimate you like he did? Comment below. I want to know your choice.